connecting forebrain and hindbrain, thick fibrous tracts of midbrain. As we observe the forebrain, now these are called the olfactory lobes, and these are called the cerebral hemispheres, and this one we call it as diencephalon, and these are called the optic lobes, and this one we call it as the C means cerebellum, and this one we call it as the M means medulla oblongata. Now this part we call it as the forebrain, and this part we call it as hindbrain, and this part we call it as midbrain. In the midbrain, you have to observe the diagram. On the ventral side of midbrain, VS means ventral side. On the ventral side of midbrain, two longitudinal nerve tracts are present. On the ventral side of midbrain, two longitudinal nerve tracts are present called crura cerebri. Crura cerebri. And now the crura cerebri present on the ventral side of midbrain. The crura cerebri connects forebrain, midbrain ventrally. So the ventral side indicated by dots. This is hindbrain, this is the forebrain, and this one we call it as the midbrain. On the ventral side of midbrain, crura cerebri. The crura cerebri ventrally connects the forebrain and hindbrain. How many crura cerebri? Only two. What type of nerve tracts they are? Longitudinally arranged. Now we go for the next question. The structure that lies behind the anterior choroid plexus. The anterior choroid plexus. Now here, what is meant by choroid plexus? That means it is non-nervous. It is non-nervous. In the choroid plexus, no nerves. It is non-nervous, but highly vascularized. What is meant by vascularized? Bunch of blood capillaries. Bunch of blood capillaries. What is meant by choroid plexus? Here no nerves, non-nervous, but what are present? Bunch of blood capillaries, vascularized. Plexus means bunch of blood capillaries. Here the question is the structure that lies behind anterior choroid plexus. Now this one we call it as the diencephalon. This is the diencephalon, and this is the cavity of diencephalon that we call it as diocele. Now this is the roof of diocele. The roof of diocele has anterior choroid plexus. Just behind anterior choroid plexus, what is present? A stalk is present, that we call it as the pineal stalk. Attached to the pineal stalk, what is present? The pineal body is present. Now the pineal body present on the dorsal side or above diencephalon, so it is also called the epiphysis. Now here the answer is behind the structure that lies behind anterior choroid plexus, that we call it as the pineal stalk. Now we go for the next question. Diocele and metacele are connected through. What is meant by diocele? It is the cavity. Metacele, it is the cavity. Now this part we call it as the diencephalon. This we call it as diencephalon. In the diencephalon, a cavity is present called diocele. It is numbered as the third ventricle. Now this one we call it as the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata. Now in the medulla oblongata, a cavity is present called the metacele. It is numbered as fourth ventricle. Now the diocele opens into metacele through a canal that we call it as iter. Where it is present? In the midbrain. What is the canal present in the midbrain? Iter. What is the other name of iter? Aqueduct of Sylvius. What type of cavities are communicated through iter? The diocele, that is the third cavity, connected to metacele, that is the fourth cavity. Now here the answer is aqueduct of Sylvius or iter. Now we go for the next question. Now as we observe the list 1, neopallium, optic thalami, posterior choroid plexus, anterior choroid plexus. Now as we observe this part, we call it as the cerebrum. Now this part we call it as the cerebrum. This is called the cerebrum. Okay. Now this is the dorsal side of cerebrum. Now as we observe the dorsal side of cerebrum, the dorsal side of cerebrum is gray in color. The dorsal side of cerebrum is called the neopallium. Now this one we call it as the diencephalon. Now L means lateral sides. Now the lateral sides of diencephalon we call it as the optic thalami. Now the roof of diencephalon as bunch of blood capillaries, anterior choroid plexus. Now this one we call it as the medulla oblongata. The roof of metacele as bunch of blood capillaries, posterior choroid plexus. So how many choroid plexus? 2. What is the function of choroid plexus? They secrete cerebrospinal fluid. Now you observe the correct answer is the second option. Now we go for the next question. Find the correct matching. Now we have to discuss the cranial nerves. Now 3 columns matching. The first one vagus, the second one is glossopharyngeal, third is trochlear, fourth is auditory. Now distribution. Vagus supplied to muscles of eye. Now as we observe the vagus supplies branches behind the head. The vagus does not supply any branch to head. The vagus does not give any branch to the head. The vagus gives branches to the parts behind the head. But here vagus muscles of eye. Eyes are present in the head region. Vagus does not give any branch to the head region. So the first statement is wrong. Second, glossopharyngeal, that is the 9th pair of cranial nerves. It is mixed. It gives branches to tongue and pharynx. What are the branches? One is lingual branch and the second one we call it as pharyngeal. Again repeating, 9th pair of cranial nerves, glossopharyngeal. Depending upon function, mixed. What are the branches? One is lingual, one is pharyngeal. They are supplied to tongue and pharynx. Third, trochlear. What is the other name of trochlear? Pathetic. That is the 4th pair of cranial nerves. Supplies the branches to, or the 4th pair supplied to superior oblique eyeball muscles. Depending upon the function, the 4th one is motor. Now students, regarding the main EAMCET examination, the repeated questions: what are the purely sensory cranial nerves? the first pair, second pair and eighth pair, and purely motor cranial nerves, the third one, the fourth one, the sixth one and the 11th one and 12th one. And what are the mixed cranial nerves? The mixed cranial nerves are 5th one, 7th one, 9th one and 10th one. What are purely sensory cranial nerves? First pair, second, 8th. And next, what are the motor cranial nerves? 3rd, 4th, 6th, 11th, 12th. What are the mixed cranial nerves? 5th, 6th, 9th and 10th. Now, auditory, it is purely sensory, but here what they gave? Mixed. So here, what is the correct answer? The second and third, that is glossopharyngeal and trochlear. Now we go for the next question. Two paraseals connect with each other and open into third ventricle through. Now, this part we call it as one cerebral hemisphere, and this one we call it as another cerebral hemisphere. Now, in the cerebral hemisphere, cavity present that we call it as paraseel. They are also called the lateral ventricles. Okay. Now, they are numbered as first ventricle, second ventricle. Now, this part we call it as the diencephalon. In the diencephalon, a cavity is present called diocele. It is numbered as third ventricle. Now, here the question is, the paraseals open into third ventricle through an aperture called foramen of Monro. Now, here the answer is foramen of Monro. Now, we go for the next question. The number of cervical sympathetic ganglia. As we observe the sympathetic nervous system, this part we call it as a vertebral column, we know very well. Now I am drawing that one. Now this is called the vertebral column. Okay, this is called vertebral column. VC means vertebral column, and these are called the vertebrae. And this part we call it as the neck, and this part we call it as abdomen. From the neck to abdomen, on either side of vertebral column, what are present? The sympathetic nerve chains are present. Sympathetic nerve chains. How many sympathetic nerve chains? 2. Now, on the sympathetic nerve chain, what are present? The ganglia. Now, here what is the question? Number of cervical. What is meant by cervical neck? Number of cervical sympathetic ganglia on each side. Now, on each side, here 2, here 2. Total number of cervical sympathetic ganglia 2 plus 2, 4. But here on each side, so the answer is 2. Now we go for the next question. The average resting membrane potential. As we observe the nerve impulse propagation, now this one we call it as the axon. The axon is also called the nerve fiber. Now the axon is covered and protected by axolemma. That is nothing but the plasma lemma. Now the axon is said to be at rest. Whenever the axolemma is said to be at rest, outside what charge is present? Positive charge. Inside what charge is present? Negative. So at rest, the potential we call it as resting membrane potential. What is the resting membrane potential at rest? That is minus 70 millivolts. Now here the answer is minus 70 millivolts. Now we go for the next question. What is meant by spike potential? Now, the axolemma is said to be at rest. Now, whenever the axolemma is said to be at rest, what is the potential? Resting membrane potential. What is the resting membrane potential? Minus 70 millivolts. Now we are giving what type of stimulus? The threshold stimulus. We are giving the threshold stimulus. Because of the threshold stimulus, minus 70 millivolts becomes minus 55 millivolts and suddenly raises to, that is, plus 45 millivolts. This we call it as the action potential, or it is called the spike potential. Again it is repeating, whenever the axolemma is said to be at rest, what type of potential? Resting membrane potential. What is the resting membrane potential? Minus 70 millivolts. Now in this stage only the axolemma receives the stimulus. Now we are giving what type of stimulus? Threshold stimulus. Whenever it is called threshold stimulus, whenever because of the threshold stimulus minus 70 becomes minus 55, immediately it is called the threshold stimulus. Because of the threshold stimulus, minus 70 millivolts becomes minus 55 and suddenly raises up to plus 45. That we call it as action potential. Yet this potential inside the axon, the stimulus propagates or passes or passages. Now here, what is the spike potential? Plus 45 millivolts. Now we go for the next question. Assertion. Parasympathetic nervous system is craniosacral outflow. You have to observe the question. Parasympathetic nervous system is craniosacral outflow, but not division. We are asking outflow. Reason, it is the outflow is by the preganglionic nerve fibers of 3rd, 7th, 9th, 10th cranial nerves and 2nd, 3rd, 4th sacral spinal nerves. Now as we observe the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, we are discussing the parasympathetic the nervous system. In the parasympathetic nervous system, one we call it as preganglionic neurons. Now this is ganglion. In front of ganglion, the neuron present called preganglionic neuron. Behind the ganglion, the neuron present postganglionic neuron. Now here we are asking what type of question? Parasympathetic nervous system is called craniosacral outflow. That means in the parasympathetic nervous system, as we observe the preganglionic neurons, and these are preganglionic neurons present in front of the ganglion. Now these are the axons of preganglionic neurons. A means axons, preganglionic neurons. The axons of preganglionic neurons present in the 3rd, 7th, 9th, 10th cranial nerves and 2nd, 3rd, 4th sacral spinal nerves. The axons of preganglionic neurons of parasympathetic nervous system present in the 3rd, 7th, 9th, 10th cranial nerves, 2nd, 3rd, 4th sacral spinal nerves. So it is called craniosacral outflow. Now the answer is both are correct or he explains here. Now we go for the next question. Transmission of nerve impulse across a synapse is accomplished by neurotransmitter. And now as we observe the nerve impulse transmission through synapse. Now you observe this one, we call it as a neuron. Now it has the dendrons. D means dendrons. Now this is cyton and this is axon, and these are called teledendrons. We are having the names, so I am using the short words: dendron, cyton, axon, teledendron. Now this one we call it as SY, synapse, and this is another neuron. Like that the neurons are arranged. Now these are called dendrons, cyton, axon, teledendrons. Now in front of the synapse it is called presynaptic neuron. Behind the synapse it is called postsynaptic neuron. Now in order to pass the information through the synapse, what is the required neurotransmitter? Here what is the popular neurotransmitter? Acetylcholine. Now this dot indicates the stimulus. First of all, the stimulus received by dendrons of presynaptic neuron, then goes to cyton, then axon, then teledendrons. Now with the help of acetylcholine passes through synapse, then received by dendrons of postsynaptic neuron, then cyton, axon, teledendrons. Like that the information passes in one direction. So these are the teledendrons of one neuron and dendrons of another neuron. Here the question is, transmission of nerve impulse across a synapse is accomplished by neurotransmitters. 100% correct, A is correct. Or transmission of nerve impulse across a synapse occurs from dendrites of a neuron to the axons of next neuron. That is the wrong. That means teledendrons of one neuron to that of dendrons of another neuron. So A is correct, R is wrong. Now we go for the next question. Choose the correct statement. Now we have to discuss each and every statement. Now the first one, number of cranial nerves in snakes only 10 pairs, in remaining reptiles 12 pairs. So the first statement is wrong. Second, in warm-blooded animals, what are the warm-blooded animals? Birds and mammals. In warm-blooded animals, number of cranial nerves are 12 pairs. That is correct. Third, first and second ventricles are rhinoceles. But what will learn? First and second ventricles are called paraceles. So third option wrong. Fourth, in a rabbit 2 optic lobes are present. In all mammals how many optic lobes? 4. That is called corpora quadrigemina. So of these 4 statements, what is the correct one? In warm-blooded animals, that means aves and mammals, how many cranial nerves are present? 12 pairs. Now the next question is, list 1, olfactory lobes, cerebrum, diencephalon, medulla oblongata. Now list 2, rhinoceles, myliocele, diocele, optocele and paraceles. What are these? These are the cavities. Now olfactory lobes, what are the cavities? Rhinoceles, they are not having any number. Cerebrum having paraceles numbered as 1 and 2. Diencephalon, what is the cavity? Diocele, numbered as third ventricle. Medulla oblongata, it has the cavity metacele or myliocele, both are correct. It is numbered as the fourth. Now next question, nerve impulse travel faster in myelinated axons than in non-myelinated axons. Now as we observe the myelinated axon, this one we call it as cyton and these are called dendrons, it is called cyton, and this one we call it as the axon. In myelinated axons, this one we call it as the myelin sheath. This one we call it as the myelin sheath. Now as we observe the myelin sheath, it is also called the neurilemma. The myelin sheath is made by lipids. Where myelin sheath present, there is no propagation. There is no propagation. There is no passage of impulse. So, in myelinated axons, where myelin is absent, that place we call it as node. That node we call it as Ranvier node. So, in myelinated axons, the propagation or impulse jumps from one node to another node. Such type of jumping transmission is called saltatory. Because of the presence of Ranvier nodes in myelinated axons, the nerve impulse propagation faster than that of the non-myelinated axon. In non-myelinated axon, this one we call it as axon. You observe the diagram, here no myelin. In the non-myelinated axon, the impulse slowly passes, but here the impulse jumps from one node to another node. That we call it as saltatory conduction. It is faster than that of this one. So both are correct or he explains A. Now we go for the next question. The only cranial nerve that innervates the organs of chest and abdomen. Now you have to observe this part we call it as the chest and this part we call it as abdomen. And we know very well this part we call it as a head region. Behind head region, the parts are getting the branches from the 10th pair of cranial nerves that we call it as vagus. Vagus does not give any branches to the parts of head region. The vagus gives branches to the parts behind the head region. The chest present behind the head region. The abdomen present behind the head region. So here the answer is the vagus. Now we go for the next one. Autonomous nervous system is called accelerator and brake system. Now we are having a good idea regarding the bike. Now in the bike, as we observe the accelerator, as we raise the accelerator, the vehicle moves forward. Now if we apply the braking system, the bike is going to stop. That means there is a synchronizing action between accelerator and braking system. In the autonomous nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic, two systems are present. The sympathetic system increases one activity, parasympathetic decreases one activity. For example, in our body, as we observe the blood pressure 120/80, that is the BP of a healthy person, 120/80. Now the sympathetic nervous system increases the blood pressure, parasympathetic decreases the blood pressure. So automatically what is going to happen in the body of healthy person? The sympathetic nervous system always increases the blood pressure, whereas the parasympathetic decreases the blood pressure. So ultimately, what is the normal blood pressure of a healthy person? 120/80. Here, what is the accelerator? Sympathetic. What is the braking system? Parasympathetic. So sympathetic, parasympathetic activities are antagonistic. So in our body, all activities are at balanced state. So that the autonomous nervous system is called accelerator and braking, because in the autonomous, sympathetic and parasympathetic functions are antagonistic. They work oppositely. Because of the accelerator, vehicle moves forward. Because of the applying the brake, the vehicle stops. Like that, sympathetic and parasympathetic works. So both are correct. RE explains A. Now we go for the next question. Arrange the following cranial nerves in a sequence. Arrange the following cranial nerves in a sequence. Now, in case of all reptiles except the snakes, and in case of birds, in case of mammals, how many pairs of cranial nerves are present? 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Now, the first one we call it as the olfactory, the second one we call it as optic, and the third one we call it as oculomotor, and the fourth one we call it as trochlear or pathetic, and the fifth one we call it as trigeminal, and the sixth one we call it as abducens, and the seventh one we call it as the facial, and the eighth one we call it as auditory, and the ninth one we call it as glossopharyngeal, 10th one we call it as the vagus, and the 11th one we call it as hypoglossal, and the 12th one we call it as spinal accessory. Now these are the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Here what they are asking, arrange the following cranial nerves in a sequence, that is abducens. Take for example abducens, that is the 6th pair of cranial nerve. What about the hypoglossal? That is the 11th pair. What is the glossopharyngeal? That is the 9th pair. What about the oculomotor? That is the 3rd pair. What is the pathetic? That is the 4th pair. Now oculomotor, now this is 3rd one. What about the trochlear or pathetic? That we call it as 4th. Abducens 6th, 3rd, 4th, 6th. What about the glossopharyngeal? 9th. And hypoglossal, that one we call it as 11th. So based on this we have to arrange the cranial nerves in a order. Now we go for the next question. The H-shaped part of spinal cord is made up of. Now as we observe the transverse section of spinal cord, as we observe the transverse section of spinal cord, this one we call it as the central canal C. Around the central canal, what is present? The H-shaped grey matter. Now you have to observe the diagram. This one we call it as the grey matter. What is the shape of grey matter? H shape or butterfly. And this one we call it as white matter. Now in the grey matter, what are present? The cell bodies. And the next one we call it as dendrites. And the next one we call it as non-myelinated axons. Now you observe the answer. The H-shaped part, that is grey matter. The grey matter of spinal cord is consisting of now cell bodies, dendrites, and non-medullated or non-myelinated axons. The next question. Now corpora striata, optic thalami, and optic lobes, cerebellum, fore and midbrains. Now you have to observe the list one again. Now we call it as corpora striata. Now these are called the cerebral hemispheres. In the cerebral hemispheres, one type of nerve tracts, we call it as corpora striata. The corpora striata connected by a nervous tissue, that we call it as anterior commissure. Now the cerebral hemispheres are connected by the corpus callosum. And next, as we observe the diencephalon, these are called the optic thalami. Optic thalami. The optic thalami connected by the median commissure. And these are called the optic lobes. Now you observe how many optic lobes? 4 optic lobes. Now these are called anterior optic lobes. The anterior optic lobes connected by what type of commissure? The posterior commissure. Now you have to observe corpora striata connected by anterior commissure, optic thalami connected by the median commissure, and optic lobes, anterior optic lobes connected by the posterior commissure. The cerebellum, now this part we call it as the cerebellum. Now this is the left part, right part, and this one we call it as the cerebellum. The right and left parts of cerebellum connected by the pons varolii. Now what about the fore and midbrain? On the ventral side, this one we call it as the forebrain. On the ventral side, this one we call it as the hindbrain. Now the forebrain and hindbrain ventrally connected by crura cerebri. Now based on this information, the answer is the second one. Now we go for the next question. Arrange the following structures of spinal cord from outer to inner side in the correct sequential order. Here we are asking regarding the spinal cord. Arrange the structures of spinal cord from outer to inner. Now as we observe the mammals, 3 meninges are present. Now we are asking the spinal cord. Now this one we call it as the jura-mater. The jura-mater is followed by arachnoid layer, and this is followed by the pia-mater, and this one we call it as the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, what is the first matter? That we call it as white matter, and this one we call it as gray matter. Jura-mater, arachnoid layer, pia-mater, and in the spinal cord first white matter and gray matter. Jura-mater, arachnoid layer, pia-mater, white matter, gray matter, and gray matter followed by the central canal. Now based on this information, the answer is the third one. Now we go for the next question. Functional coordination among body parts is achieved rapidly and slowly in the body of vertebrates. In all vertebrates from fishes to human being, the neural activities are controlled and coordinated by nervous system. It is rapid. The chemical activities controlled and coordinated slowly by endocrine system. So here rapidly, slowly, nervous system, endocrine system. Now the next question. Which of the following is a lipid soluble? The hormones are classified into fat soluble, water soluble. The fat also called lipid. Now here what is the hormone that dissolves in the lipid material? That we call it as the thyroid. Now the next question. Chemical messengers. In the body of vertebrates, the ductless glands are called endocrine glands. Endocrine glands secrete hormones. They are called the chemical messengers. Next question. Hormones are never in the food material. We are not getting the hormones from the outside because the hormones are synthesized by endocrine glands. They are also called ductless glands. The endocrine glands release hormones in the blood plasma. Now both are correct. RE explains A. Next one. Hormones are not stored or accumulated in the body. Once the action of hormone is completed, it is not stored in the body. It comes out along with the urine. So hormones are not stored or accumulated in the body because hormones that are not used or quickly excreted in urine or get inactivated or get degenerated. So both are correct. R explains A. The next one is chemical messengers means hormones show specificity in their action. Take for example This is called the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland secretes thyroxine hormone, but here the thyroxine hormone has no work. That means the hormone having a target organ somewhere, that we call it as the specificity. Chemical messengers show specificity in their action. Each hormone having a specific target organ, so they act only on specific cells or specific body parts, so it is called the specificity. So both are correct. RE explains A. Now the last question. Secretion of calcitonin lowers, that means decreases, blood calcium and phosphates levels. What is going to happen? Calcitonin inhibits bone reabsorption. Now this one we call it as the bone, and these are called the osteoclasts. Osteoclasts. Now they perform resorption. What is meant by resorption? Secretion. Now you have to observe the assertion. The calcitonin hormone decreases calcium phosphorus levels of blood because it stops the activity of osteoclasts. What is the function of osteoclasts? Resorption. What is meant by resorption? Secretion. So the calcitonin stops the function of osteoclasts. That means they do not perform secretion. Automatically in the blood plasma, the calcium level, phosphorus level decreases because the calcitonin stops the function of osteoclasts. What is the function of osteoclasts? Resorption. What is meant by resorption? Secretion. Because of calcitonin, these cells do not secrete calcium and phosphorus, so that in the blood plasma calcium level, phosphorus level decreases. Both are correct. Or explains A.